guys, today I'm live talking about Money Mania, the Mississippi scheme from Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles McKay. My name's May Doldelau. My blog is yesfinanciallyfree.com. If you haven't already, go ahead, visit my blog, put in your first name, email address on the right side, and click the big red yes button, and you will receive the free ebook, Working Parents Guide to Financial Freedom, sent directly to your email. And you get on my email list where I send out emails about when I'll be live, what I'll be talking about. Like today I sent my email list an email and told them I would be talking and reading this book today. So we are going to be reading books in the summer, and I'm excited. That's June and July. And a little bit about myself. I live in Hawaii, Waikiki, with my husband Jamal and our 7-year-old son Jordan. We own this condo, another condo down the street, which is an Airbnb business. But back in 2011, I owned no property, never had. I had over $40,000 of credit card debts, which I paid off by 2016, quit my job, proved if I was net worth by $500,000, and making almost $500 a month in passive income every month. So I blog about financial freedom. I help people become financially free. I started coaching clients in 2016 in what I call Finance Freedom Mastermind programs. All of that is on my blog, yesfinanciallyfree.com. If you go to the products page, you can see all of my products. There's mastermind programs where you meet with me live. There's just really quick 7-day challenges where you get email lessons on how to create 2 streams of passive income. There's a lot of great stuff there. So go check it out on my blog, okay? So today, let's read. And I'm reading because it's summer vacation. I spend a lot of time with my son. He's 7 years old. So we're going to be doing this all summer. So this book is highly recommended if you want to become financially free. So I highly recommend you read it. You can get it for free online. It is a copyright-free book. So let's begin. I'm excited to read it. I've never read this book, although I know of it. So let's begin. So it's called the Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles McKay. Okay. And I'm just starting the book today. And the first chapter is the Money Mania. Take a look. I'm going to skip the contents here, going down to the preface. We're going to read the preface first. In reading the history of nations, we find that, like individuals, they have their whims and their peculiarities, their season and recklessness. When they care not what they do, we find that whole communities suddenly fix their minds upon one object and go mad in its pursuit, that millions of people become simultaneously impressed with one delusion and run after it till their attention is caught by some new folly more captivating than the first. We see one nation suddenly seized from its highest to its lowest members with a fierce desire of military glory. Another as suddenly becoming crazed upon a religious scruple, and neither of them recovering its senses until it has shed rivers of blood and sowed a harvest of groans and tears to be reaped by its posterity. At an early age in the annals of Europe, its population lost their wits about the sepulchre of Jesus and crowded in frenzied multitudes to the Holy Land. Another age went mad for fear of the devil and offered up hundreds of thousands of victims to the delusion of witchcraft. At another time, the many became crazed on the subject of the philosopher's stone and committed follies till then unheard of in the pursuit. It was once thought a venial offense in very many countries of Europe to destroy an enemy by slow poison. Persons who would have revolted at the idea of stabbing a man to the heart drugged his pottage without scruple. Ladies of gentle birth and manners caught the contagion of murder until poisoning under their auspices became quite fashionable. Delusions, though notorious to all the world, have subsisted for ages, flourishing as widely among civilized and polished nations as among the early barbarians with whom they originated. That of dueling, for instance, and the belief of omens and divination of the future, which seem to defy the progress of knowledge to eradicate them entirely from the popular mind. Money, again, has often been the cause of the delusion of multitudes. Sober nations have all at once become desperate gamblers and risk almost their existence upon the turn of a piece of paper. To trace the history of the most prominent of these delusions is the object of the present pages. Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly, one by one. Some of the subjects introduced may be familiar to the reader, but the author hopes that sufficient novelty and detail will be found even in these to render them acceptable, while they could not be wholly omitted in justice to the subject of which it was proposed. The memoirs of the South Sea Madness and the Mississippi Delusion are more complete and copious than are to be found elsewhere, and the same may be said of the history of the Witch Mania, which contains an account of its terrific progress in Germany, in part a part of the subject which has been left comparatively untouched by Sir Walter Scott in his letters on demonology and witchcraft, the most important that have yet appeared, the most interesting subject. Popular delusions began so early, spread so widely, and have lasted so long that instead of 2 or 3 volumes, 50 would scarcely suffice to detail their history. The present may be considered more of a miscellany of delusions than a history. A chapter only in the great and awful book of human folly, which yet remains to be written, in which Porson once jestingly said he would write in 500 volumes. Interspersed are sketches of some lighter matters, amusing instances of imitativeness and wrongheadedness of the people, rather than examples of folly and delusion. Religious matters have been purposely excluded as incompatible with the limits prescribed to the present work. A mere list of them would alone be sufficient to occupy a volume. Okay, so here we have Money Mania, the Mississippi Scheme. Okay, some in clandestine companies combine, erect new stocks to trade beyond the line, with air and empty names beguile the town, and raise new credits first, then cry 'em down. Divide the empty nothing into shares, and set the crowd together by the ears. Defoe. The personal character and career of one man are so intimately connected with the great scheme of the years 1719 and 1720 that a history of the Mississippi Madness can have no fitter introduction than a sketch of the life. What a great name, John Law. Historians are divided in opinion as to whether they should designate him a knave or a madman. Both epithets were unsparingly applied to him in his lifetime, and while the unhappy consequences of his projects were still deeply felt. Posterity, however, has found reason to doubt the justice of the accusation and to confess that John Law was neither knave nor madman, but one more deceived than deceiving, more sinned against than sinning. He was thoroughly acquainted with the philosophy and true principles of credit. He understood the monetary question better than any man of his day, and if his system fell with a crash so tremendous, it was not so much his fault as that of the people amongst whom he had erected it. He did not calculate upon the avaricious frenzy of a whole nation, did not see that confidence, like mistrust, could be increased almost ad infinitum, and that hope was as extravagant as fear. How was he to foretell that the French people, like the man in the fable, would kill, in their frantic eagerness, the fine goose he had brought to lay them so many golden eggs? His fate was like that which may be supposed to have overtaken the first adventurous boatman who rowed from Erie to Ontario. Broad and smooth was the river on which he embarked, rapid and pleasant was his progress, and who was to stay him in his career? Alas, for him! The cataract was nay. He saw, when it was too late, that the tide which wafted him so joyously along was a tide of destruction. And when he endeavored to retrace his way, he found that the current was too strong for his weak efforts to stem, and that he drew nearer every instant to the tremendous falls. Down he went over the sharp rocks, and the waters with him. He was dashed to pieces with his bark, but the waters, maddened and turned to foam by the rough descent, only boiled and bubbled for a time, and then flowed on again as smoothly as ever. Just so it was with the law and the French people. He was the boatman, and they were the waters. John Law was born in Edinburgh in the year 1671. His father was the younger of an ancient family of Fife, and carried on the business of a goldsmith and banker. He amassed considerable wealth in his trade, sufficient to enable him to gratify the wish so common among his countrymen of adding a territorial designation to his name. He purchased with this view the estates of Lauriston and Randleston of the 5th or 4th on the borders of West and Mid Lothian, and was thenceforth known as Law of Lauriston. The subject of our memoir, being the eldest son, was received into his father's counting house at the age of 14, and for 3 years labored hard to acquire an insight into the principles of banking, and then carried on in Scotland. He had always manifested his great love for the study of numbers, and his proficiency in the mathematics was considered extraordinary in one of his tender years. At the age of 17, he was tall, strong, and well-made, and his face, although deeply scarred with the smallpox, was agreeable in its expression and full of intelligence. At this time, he began to neglect his business, and becoming vain of his person, indulged in considerable extravagance of attire. He was a great favorite with the ladies, by whom he was called Beau Law, while the other sex, despising his foppery, nicknamed him Jessamy John. At the death of his father, which happened in 1688, he withdrew entirely from the desk, which had become so irksome, and being possessed of the revenues of the paternal estate of Lauriston, he proceeded to London to see the world. He was now very young, very vain, good-looking, tolerably rich, and quite uncontrolled. It is no wonder that on his arrival in the capital he should launch out into extravagance. He soon became a regular frequenter of the gaming houses, and by pursuing a certain plan based upon some abstruse calculation of chances, he contrived to gain considerable sums. All the gamblers envied him his luck. Many made it a point to watch his play and stake their money on the same chances. In affairs of gallantry he was equally fortunate. Ladies of the first rank smiled graciously upon the handsome Scotchman, the young, the rich, the witty, and the obliging. But all these successes only paved the way for reverses. After he had been for 9 years exposed to the dangerous attractions of the gay life he was leading, he became an irrecoverable gambler. As his love of play increased in violence, it diminished in prudence. Great losses were only to be repaired by still greater ventures, and one unhappy day he lost more than he could repay without mortgaging his family estate. To that step he was driven at last. At the same time his gallantry brought him into trouble. A love affair or slight flirtation with a lady of the name of Villiers exposed him to the resentment of Mr. Wilson, by whom he was challenged to fight a duel. Law accepted, and had the ill fortune to shoot his antagonist dead upon the spot. He was arrested the same day and brought to trial for murder by the relatives of Mr. Wilson. He was afterwards found guilty and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to a fine upon the ground that the offense only amounted to manslaughter. An appeal being lodged by a brother of the deceased, Law was detained in the King's Bench, whence, by some means or other, which he never explained, he contrived to escape. And an action being instituted against the sheriffs, he was advertised in the Gazette, and a reward offered for his apprehension. He was described as Captain John Law, a Scotchman, aged 26, very tall, black, lean man, well-shaped, above 6 feet high, with large pockholes on his face, big nose, and speaking broad and loud, as this was rather a caricature than a description of him. It has been supposed that it was drawn up with a view to favor his escape. He succeeded in reaching the continent, where he traveled for 3 years and devoted much of his attention to the monetary and banking affairs of the countries through which he passed. He stayed a few months in Amsterdam and speculated to some extent in the funds. His mornings were devoted to the study of finance and the principles of trade, and his evenings to the gaming house. It's generally believed that he returned to Edinburgh in the year 1700. It is certain that he published in that city his proposals and reasons for constituting a council of trade. His pamphlet did not excite much attention. In a short time afterwards, he published a project for establishing what he called a land bank, the notes issued by which were never to exceed the value of the entire lands of the state, upon ordinary interest, or were to be equal in value to the land, with the right to enter into possession at a certain time. The project excited a good deal of discussion in the Scottish Parliament, and a motion for the establishment of such a bank was brought forward by a neutral party called the Squadrone, whom Law had interested in his favor. The Parliament ultimately passed a resolution to the effect that to establish any kind of paper credit so as to force it to pass was an improper expedient for the nation. Upon the failure of this project and his efforts to procure a pardon for the murder of Mr. Wilson, Law withdrew to the continent, resumed his traveling. For 14 years, he continued to roam about in Flanders, Holland, Hungary, Italy, and France. He soon became intimately acquainted with the extent of the trade and resources of each, and daily more confirmed in his opinion that no country could prosper without a paper currency. During the whole of this time, he appeared to have chiefly supported himself by successful play. At every gambling house of note in the capitals of Europe, he was known and appreciated as one better skilled in the intricacies of chance than any other man in the day. It is stated in the Biographie Universelle that he was expelled first from Venice, afterwards from Genoa, by the magistrates who thought him a visitor too dangerous for the youth of those cities. During his residence in Paris, he rendered himself obnoxious to D'Argenson, the lieutenant general of the police, by whom he was ordered to quit the capital. This did not take place, however, before he had made the acquaintance in the saloons of the Duc de Vendôme, the Prince of de Conti, and the gay Duke of Orleans, the latter of whom was destined afterwards to exercise so much influence over his fate. The Duke of Orleans was pleased with the vivacity and good sense of the Scottish adventurer, while the latter was no less pleased with the wit and amiability of the prince, who promised to become his patron. They were often thrown into each other's society, and Law seized every opportunity to instill his financial doctrines into the mind of one whose proximity to the throne pointed him out as destined, at no very distant date, to play an important role in the government. Shortly before the death of Louis XIV, or as some say in 1708, Law proposed a scheme to finance Desmarets, the comptroller. Louis is reported to have inquired whether the projector were a Catholic, and on being answered in the negative, to have declined having anything to do with him. It was after this repulse that he visited Italy. His mind being still occupied with the schemes of finance, he proposed to Victor Armaduce, Duke of Savoy, to establish his land bank in that country. The Duke replied that his dominions were too circumscribed for the execution of so great a project, and that he was by far too poor a potentate to be ruined. He advised him, however, to try the King of France once more, for he was sure if he knew anything of the French character that the people would be delighted with a plan, not only so new but so plausible. Louis XIV died in 1715, and the heir to the throne, being an infant only 7 years old, the Duke of Orleans assumed the reins of government as regent during his minority. Law now found himself in a more favorable position. The tide of his affairs had come, which, taken at the flood, was to waft him on to fortune. The regent was his friend, already acquainted with his theory and pretensions, and inclined moreover to aid him in any efforts to restore the wounded credit of France, bowed down to the earth by the extravagance of the long reign of Louis XIV. Hardly was that monarch laid in his grave ere the popular hatred, suppressed so long, burst forth against his memory. He who during his life had been flattered with an excess of adulation, to which history scarcely offers a parallel, was now cursed as a tyrant, a bigot, and a plunderer. His statues were pelted and disfigured, his effigies torn down amid the execrations of the populace, and his name rendered synonymous with selfishness and oppression. The glory of his arms was forgotten, and nothing was remembered but his reverses, his extravagance, and his cruelty. The finances of the country were in a state of the utmost disorder. A profuse and corrupt monarch, whose profuseness and corruption were imitated by almost every functionary from the highest to lowest grade, had brought France on the verge of ruin. The national debt amounted to 3 millions of livres, to the revenue of 145 millions, and the expenses of the government to 142 millions per annum, leaving only 3 million to pay the interest upon 3,000 millions. The first care of the regent was to discover a remedy for any evils of such magnitude, and a council was early summoned to take the matter into consideration. The Duke de Saint-Simon was of opinion that nothing could save the country from revolution but a remedy at once bold and dangerous. He advised the regent to convoke the States General and declare a national bankruptcy. The Duc de Noailles, a man of accompanying principles, an accomplished courtier, and totally averse from giving himself any trouble or annoyance that ingenuity could escape from, opposed the project of St. Simon with all his influence. He represented the expedient as alike dishonest and ruinous, The regent was of the same opinion, and this desperate remedy fell to the ground. The measures ultimately adopted, though they promised fair, only aggravated the evil. The first and most dishonest measure was of no advantage to the state. A recoinage was ordered, by which the currency was depreciated 1/5. Those who took 1,000 pieces of gold or silver to the mint received back an amount of the coin the same nominal value, but only 4/5 of the weight of metal. By this contrivance, the treasury gained 72 millions of livres, and all the commercial operations of the country were disordered. The trifling diminution of the taxes silenced the clamors of the people. For the slight present advantage, the great prospective evil was forgotten. My goodness, that's crazy. A chamber of justice was next instituted to inquire into the malversions of the loan contractors and the farmers of the revenues. Tax collectors were never very popular in any country, but those of France at that period deserved all the odium with which they were loaded. As soon as these farmers general, with all their hosts of subordinate agents called maltotiers, were called to account for their misdeeds, the most extravagant joy took possession of the nation. The Chamber of Justice, instituted chiefly for this purpose, was endowed with very extensive powers. It was composed of the presidents and councils of the parliament, and the judges of the courts of aid and of requests, and the officers of the Chamber of Account under the general presidence of the Minister of Finance. Informers were encouraged to give evidence against the offenders by the promise of 1/5 of the fines and confiscations. 1/10 of all concealed effects belonging to the guilty were promised to such as should furnish the means of discovering them. The promulgation of the edict constituting this court caused a degree of consternation among those principally concerned, which can only be accounted for on the supposition that their peculation had been enormous, but they met with no sympathy. The proceedings against them justified their terror. The Bastille was soon unable to contain the prisoners that were sent to it, and the gaols all over the country teemed with guilty or suspected persons. An order was issued to all innkeepers and postmasters to refuse horses to such as endeavored to seek safety in flight, and all persons were forbidden, under heavy fines, to harbor them or favor their evasion. Some were condemned to the pillory, others to the galleys, and the least guilty to fine and imprisonment. One only, Samuel Bernard, a rich banker and farmer general of a province remote from the capital, was sentenced to death. So great had been the illegal profits of this man, looked upon as the tyrant and oppressor of his district, that he offered 6 million of livres, 250,000 L sterling, to be allowed to escape. His bribe was refused, and he suffered the penalty of death. Others, perhaps more guilty, were more fortunate. Confiscation, owing to the concealment of their treasures by the delinquents, often produced less money than a fine. The severity of the government relaxed, and fines under the denomination of taxes were indiscriminately levied upon all offenders, but so corrupt was every department of the administration that the country benefited but little by the sums which thus flowed into the treasury. Courtiers and courtiers' wives and mistresses came in for the chief share of the spoils. One contractor had been taxed in proportion to his wealth and guilt at the sum of 12 million of livres, and the count, and he removes the name, a man of some weight in the government, called upon him and offered to procure a remission of the fine if he would give him 100,000 crowns. Oh my goodness. You are too late, my friend, replied the financier. I've already made a bargain with your wife for 50,000. About 180 million of livres were levied in this manner, of which 80 were applied in payment of the debts contracted by the government. The remainder found its way into the pockets of the courtiers. Madame de Maintenon, writing on this subject, says, "We hear every day of some new grant to the regent. The people murmur very much of this mode of employing the money taken from the peculators. The people, who after the first burst of their resentment is over, generally expresses sympathy for the weak, were indignant that so much severity should be used to so little purpose. They did not see the justice of robbing one set of rogues to fatten another. In a few months, all the more guilty had been brought to punishment, and the Chamber of Justice looked for victims in humbler walks of life. Charges of fraud and extortion were brought against tradesmen of good character in consequence of the great inducements held out to common informers. They were compelled to lay open their affairs before this tribunal in order to establish their innocence. The voice of complaint resounded from every side, and at the expiration of a year, the government found it advisable to discontinue further proceedings. Chamber of Justice was suppressed, and the general amnesty granted to all against whom no charges had yet been preferred. In the midst of this financial confusion, law appeared upon the scene. No man felt more deeply than the regent the deplorable state of the country, but no man could be more averse from putting his shoulders manfully to the wheel. He disliked the business. He signed official documents without proper examination and trusted to others what he should have undertaken himself. The cares inseparable from his high office were burdensome to him. He saw that something was necessary to be done, but he lacked the energy to do it, and had not virtue enough to sacrifice his ease and his pleasures in the attempt. No wonder that, with this character, he listened favorably to the mighty project, so easy of execution, of the clever adventurer whom he had formerly known, and whose talents he appreciated. When Law presented himself at court, he was most cordially received. He offered 2 memorials to the regent, in which he set forth the evils that had befallen France, owing to an insufficient currency at different times depreciated. He asserted that a metallic currency, unaided by paper money, was wholly inadequate to the wants of a commercial country, and particularly cited the examples of Great Britain and Holland to shew the advantages of paper. He used many sound arguments on the subject of credit, and proposed as a means of restoring that of France, then at so low an ebb among nations that he should be allowed to set up a bank, which should have the management of the royal revenues, and issued notes, both on that and on landed security. He further proposed that this bank should be administered in the king's name, but subject to the control of the commissioners to be named by the States General. While these memorials were under consideration, Law translated into French his essay on money and trade, and used every means to extend through the nation his renown as a financier. Soon became talked of. The confidence of the regent spread abroad his praise, and everyone expected great things from Monsieur Las. On the 5th of May, 1716, a royal edict was published, by which Law was authorized, in conjunction with his brother, to establish a bank under the name of Law and Company, the notes of which should be received in payment of the taxes. The capital was fixed at 6 million of livres in 12,000 shares of 500 livres each, purchasable 1/4 in specie, and the remainder in billets d'état, billets d'état. It was not thought expedient to grant him the whole of the privileges prayed for in his memorials until experience should have shown their safety and advantage. Law was now on the high road to fortune. Study of 30 years has brought to him in the management of his bank. He made all his notes payable at sight and in coin current at the time they were issued. The last was a masterstroke of policy, and immediately rendered his notes more valuable than the precious metals. The latter was constantly liable to depreciation by the unwise tampering of the government. 1,000 livres in silver might be worth their nominal value one day and be reduced 1/6 the next, but a note of Law's bank retained its original value. Publicly declare at the time that a banker deserved death if he made issues without having sufficient security to answer all demands. The consequence was that his notes advanced rapidly in public estimation. Oh, interesting. Advanced rapidly in public estimation and were received at 1% more than specie. It was not long before the trade of the country felt the benefit. Languishing commerce began to lift up her head. The taxes were paid with great regularity and less murmuring, and a degree of confidence was established that could not fail, if it continued, to become still more advantageous. In the course of a year, Law's notes rose to 15% premium, while the billets d'état, or notes issued by the government as security for the debts contracted by the extravagant Louis XIV, were at a discount, no less than 78.5%. The comparison was too great in favor of Law not to attract the attention of the whole kingdom, and his credit extended itself day by day. Branches of his bank were almost simultaneously established at Lyon, Rochelle, Tours, Amiens, and Orleans. The regent appears to have been utterly astonished at his success, and gradually to have conceived the idea that paper, which could so aid a metallic currency, could entirely supersede it. Upon this fundamental error he afterwards acted. In the meantime, Law commenced the famous project which has handed his name down to posterity. He proposed to the regent, who could refuse him nothing, to establish a company that should have the exclusive privilege of trading to the great river Mississippi and the province of Louisiana on its western bank. The country was supposed to abound in the precious metals, and the company, supported by the profits of their exclusive commerce, were to be the sole farmers of the taxes and sole coiners of money. Letters patent were issued incorporating the company in August 1717. The capital was divided into 200,000 shares of 500 livres each, the whole of which might be paid in billets d'état at their nominal value, although worth no more than 160 livres in the market. It was now that the frenzy of speculating began to seize upon the nation. Law's bank had effected so much good that any promises for the future which he thought proper to make were readily believed. The regent every day conferred new privileges upon the fortunate projector. The bank obtained the monopoly of the sale of tobacco, the sole right of refinage of gold and silver, and was finally erected into the Royal Bank of France. Amid the intoxication of success, both Law and the regent forgot the maxim so loudly proclaimed by the former, that a banker deserved death who made issues of paper without necessary funds to provide for them. As soon as the bank, from a private, became a public institution, the regent caused fabrication of notes to the amount of 1,000 millions of livres. This was the first departure from sound principles, and one for which Law was not justly blamable. While the affairs of the bank were under his control, the issues had never exceeded 60 millions. Whether Law opposed the inordinate increase is not known, but as it took place as soon as the bank was made a royal establishment, it is but fair to lay the blame of change of system upon the regent. Law found that he lived under a despotic government, but he was not yet aware of the pernicious influence which such a government could exercise upon so delicate a framework as that of credit. He discovered it afterwards to his cost, but in the meantime suffered himself to be impelled by the regent into courses which his own reason must have disapproved. With a weakness most culpable, he lent his aid in inundating the country with paper money, which, based upon no solid foundation, was sure to fall sooner or later. The extraordinary present fortune dazzled his eyes, prevented him from seeing the evil day that would burst over his head, when once, from any cause or other, the alarm was sounded. The Parliament were from the first jealous of his influence as a foreigner, and had, besides, their misgivings as to the safety of his projects. As his influence extended, their animosity increased. Deguisseau, the chancellor, was unceremoniously dismissed by the regent for his opposition to the vast increase of paper money and the constant depreciation of gold and silver coin of the realm. This only served to augment the enmity of the Parliament. And when D'Argenson, the man devoted to the interests of the regent, was appointed to the vacant chancellorship and made the same time minister of finance, they became more violent than ever. The first measure of the new minister caused a further depreciation of the coin. In order to extinguish the billets d'état, it was ordered that persons bringing to the mint 4,000 livres in specie and 1,000 livres in billets d'état should receive bank coin in the amount of 5,000 livres. D'Argenson plumed himself mightily upon this, thus creating 5,000 new and smaller livres of the 4,000 old and larger ones, being too ignorant of the true principles of trade and credit to be aware of the immense injury he was inflicting upon both. Parliament saw at once the impolicy and danger of such a system and made repeated remonstrations to the regent. The latter refused to entertain their petitions when the Parliament, by a bold and very unusual stretch of authority, commanded that no money should be received in payment but that of the old standard. The regent summoned a lit de justice and annulled the decree. The Parliament resisted and issued another. Again, the regent exercised his privilege and annulled it, till the Parliament, stung to fiercer opposition, passed another decree dated August 12, 1718, by which they forbade the Bank of Law to have any concern, either direct or indirect, in the administration of the revenue, and prohibited all foreigners, under heavy penalties, from interfering either in their own names or in that of others in the management of the finances of the state. The Parliament considered Law to be the author of all evil, and some of the councillors, of the virulence of their enmity, proposed that he should be brought to trial, and if found guilty, be hung at the gates of the Palais de Justice. Wow. Law, in great alarm, fled to the Palais Royal and threw himself on the protection of the regent, praying that measures might be taken to reduce the Parliament to obedience. The regent had nothing so much at heart, both on that account and because of disputes that had arisen relative to the legitimation of the Duke of Maine and the Count of Delusions, the sons of the late king. The parliament was ultimately overawed by the arrest of their president, and 2 of the councillors were sent to distant prisons. Thus, the first cloud upon Law's prospects blew over. Freedom from apprehension of personal danger, he devoted his attention to his famous Mississippi project. The shares of rich were rapidly rising in spite of the Parliament. At the commencement of the year 1719, an edict was published granting to the Mississippi Company the exclusive privilege of trading to the East Indies, China, and the South Seas, and all the possessions of the French East India Company established by Colbert. The company, in consequence of this great increase of their business, assumed as more appropriate the title of Company of the Indies and created 50,000 new shares. The prospects now held out by Law were more magnificent. He promised a yearly dividend of 200 livres upon each share of 500,000, which, as the shares were paid for in billets d'état at their nominal value, but worth only 100 livres, was at the rate of about 120% profit. The public enthusiasm, which had been so long rising, could not resist a vision so splendid. At least 300,000 applicants were made for the 50,000 new shares, and Law's house in the Rue de Quincampoix was beset from morning to night by the eager applicants. As it was impossible to satisfy them all, it was several weeks before a list of the new fortunate stockholders could be made out, during which time the public impatience rose to a pitch of frenzy. Dukes, marquis, counts, and their duchesses, marchionesses, countesses waited in the streets for hours every day before Mr. Law's door to know the result. At last, to avoid the jostling of the plebeian crowd, which to the number of thousands filled the whole thoroughfare, they took apartments in the adjoining houses that they might be continually near the temple whence the new Plutus was diffusing wealth. Every day the value of the old shares increased, and the fresh applications induced by the golden dreams of the whole nation became so numerous that it was deemed advisable to create no less than 300,000 new shares at 5,000 livres each, in order that the regent might take advantage of the popular enthusiasm to pay off the national debt. For this purpose, the sum of 1,500 million of livres necessary. Such was the eagerness of the nation that thrice the sum would have been subscribed if the government had authorized it. Law was now at the zenith of his prosperity, and the people were rapidly approaching the zenith of their infatuation. The highest and lowest classes were alike filled with a vision of boundless wealth. There was not a person of note among the aristocracy, with the exception of Duke of St. Simon and Marshal Villars, who was not engaged in buying or selling stock. People of every age and sex and condition in life speculated in the rise and fall of the Mississippi bonds. The Rue de Quincampoix was the greatest resort of the jobbers, and it being a narrow, inconvenient street, accidents continually occurred in it. From the tremendous pressure of the crowd, houses in it worth in ordinary times 1,000 livres in yearly rent yielded as much as 12 or 16,000. A cobbler who had a stall in it gained about 200 livres a day by letting it out and furnishing writing materials to brokers and their clients. The story goes that a humpbacked man who stood in the street gained considerable sums by lending his hump as a writing desk to eager speculators. Wow. The great concourse of persons who assembled to do business bought a still greater concourse of spectators. These again drew all the thieves and immoral characters of Paris to the spot, and constant riots and disturbances took place. At nightfall, it was often found necessary to send a troop of soldiers to clear the street. Law, finding the inconvenience of his residence, removed to the place Vendôme, whither the crowd of agitateurs followed him. That spacious square soon became as thronged as the Rue de Quincampoix. From morning to night it presented the appearance of a fair. Booths and tents were erected for the transaction of business and the sale of refreshments, and gamblers with their roulette tables stationed themselves in the very middle of the place and reaped a golden, or rather paper, harvest from the throng. The boulevards and public gardens were forsaken. Parties of pleasure took their walks in preference in the Place Vendôme, which became the fashionable lounge of the idle, as well as the general rendezvous of the busy. The noise was so great all day that the chancellor, whose court was situated in the square, complained to the regent and the municipality that he could not hear the advocates. Law, when applied to express his willingness to aid in the removal of the nuisance, and for this purpose entered into a treaty with the Prince de Carignan for the Hotel de Soissons, which had a garden of several acres in the rear. A bargain was concluded by which Law became the purchaser of the hotel at an enormous price, Prince reserving to himself the magnificent gardens as a new source of profit. It contained some fine statues and several fountains, and were altogether laid out with much taste. As soon as Law were installed as new abode, an edict was published forbidding all persons to buy or sell stock anywhere but in the gardens of the Hotel de Soissons. In the midst, among the trees, about 500 small tents and pavilions were erected for the convenience of the stock jobbers. The various colors, the gay ribbons and banners which floated from them, the busy crowds which passed continually in and out, the incessant hums of voices, the noise, the music, the strange mixture of business and pleasure on the countenance of the throng, all combined to give the place an air of enchantment that quite enraptured the Parisians. The Prince de Carignan made enormous profits while the delusion lasted. Each tent was let at the rate of 500 livres a month, and as there were at least 500 of them, his revenue monthly from the source alone must have amounted to 250,000 livres and upwards of 10,000 L sterling. The honest old soldier, Marshal Villars, was so vexed to see the folly which had smitten his countrymen that he never could speak with temper on the subject. Passing one day through the Place de Vendôme in his carriage, the choleric gentleman was so annoyed at the infatuation of the people that he abruptly ordered his coachman to stop, putting his head out of the carriage window, haranguing them for a full half an hour on their disgusting avarice. This was not a very wise proceeding on his part. Hisses and shouts of laughter resounding from every side, and jokes without number were aimed at him, there being at least strong symptoms that something more tangible was flying through the air in the direction of his head. The marshal was glad to drive on. He never again repeated the experiment. Two sober, quiet, and philosophic men of letters, M. de la Motte and Abbé Terrasson, congratulated each other that they at least were free from this strange infatuation. A few days afterwards, as the worthy abbé was coming out of the Hotel de Soissons, whither he had gone to buy shares in the Mississippi, whom should he see but his friend La Motte entering for the same purpose? "Ha!" said the abbé, smiling. "Is that you?" "Yes," said La Motte, pushing past him as fast as he was able. "And can that be you?" The next time the two scholars met, they talked of philosophy, of science, and of religion, but neither had the courage for a long time to breathe one syllable about the Mississippi. At last, when it was mentioned, they agreed that a man ought never to swear against his doing any one thing, and that there was no sort of extravagance of which even a wise man was not capable. Okay. I'm going to stop here. Let me see where I am. Man. Yeah, it's a long chapter. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to continue tomorrow, okay? Hope you guys are enjoying it, and we will continue reading tomorrow. Bye, guys. Have a great day. Aloha. And we will finish tomorrow. So I'm going to stop recording. If you are not on my email list, go to yesfinanciallyfree.com, get on it, and subscribe. Yeah, just go to the right side, name, email, address. Have a great day. Aloha.